33 kilometers. That is the width of the most powerful choke point on Earth. And this weekend, Iran announced it will never reopen it. Not after a ceasefire, not after negotiations. Never, on any terms except their own. If you think that only affects oil prices, you have not heard the full story yet. Stay with me because what I am about to show you changes how you understand every headline you will read this week. The Strait of Hormuz sits between the southeastern tip of Iran and the Sultanate of Oman. It does not look threatening on a map, but through that narrow blue corridor flows approximately 17 million barrels of oil every single day. That is 20% of all global petroleum consumption, roughly 30% of all seaborne oil trade on Earth. No other single geographic point, not the Suez Canal, not the Panama Canal, carries that kind of weight. If either of those closes, markets adjust. If the Strait of Hormuz closes and stays closed, the global economy does not adjust. It convulses, and right now it is closed, and Iran just told the world it intends to keep it that way. Before February 2026, the global energy market operated on one foundational assumption. The strait was permanent, open, and protected by American naval power. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, existed for exactly that guarantee. That was not just a military arrangement, it was the structural backbone of the post-World War II economic order. The reason shipping companies, pension funds, governments, and grocery chains could plan decades into the future. That assumption is now gone. If this is your first time here, we track developments like this daily and break down what the mainstream misses. Consider following along so you do not miss what comes next. Now, here is where it gets more dangerous. Every previous Iranian threat to close the strait, going back to 2011 and 2012, was exactly that, a threat. Pressure tactics walked back the moment international heat became too intense. Markets knew the pattern. Analysts priced it in. The world treated Iranian strait threats like a fire alarm in a building where the alarm had never once meant actual fire. But this time the building is burning. The conflict has now stretched nearly 2 months. Iran has absorbed direct military strikes from the United States and Israel. Senior IRGC commanders have been killed. The economy is under a naval blockade. And instead of signaling a willingness to negotiate, Tehran is expanding its demands. This is no longer a pressure tactic, and that distinction matters more than anything else in this story. Why would Iran lock itself into a position this extreme? The answer is ruthless strategic logic. For decades, the strait was Iran's ultimate deterrence card, the threat that kept adversaries cautious. The logic was always, attack us hard enough and we bring the global economy down with us. That threat only had value because it had never been tested. Now it has been tested. And here is the trap Iran now finds itself in. If they reopen the strait without winning major concessions, they will have proven to every future adversary that their most powerful card can be called and beaten. Their geopolitical leverage collapses permanently. So from Tehran's perspective, perverse as it sounds, the cost of reopening on weak terms may be higher than the cost of keeping it closed. This is what strategists call a credible commitment problem, and it is what makes this moment genuinely more dangerous than the headlines suggest. Now let us talk about something the coverage is almost completely ignoring. Closing the strait is one thing. Keeping it closed is another. Iran has spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. The IRGC Navy has seeded the strait and the wider Persian Gulf with thousands of sophisticated naval mines. Pressure-sensitive, difficult to detect, engineered for these shallow, complex waters. The Pentagon has acknowledged to Congress that clearing the strait after a ceasefire, under optimal conditions with full international cooperation, could take up to 6 months. 6 months. In addition to mines, Iran has deployed anti-ship missile batteries along the Iranian coastline, fast attack boats operating in swarm patterns, and submarine assets designed for this specific environment. Any attempt to force even a partial reopening would rank among the most complex and costly naval operations attempted since World War II. This is not a blockade that ends with a handshake at a press conference. The 6 nations of the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman are sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, with almost no way to move them. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have limited pipeline capacity that bypasses the strait, but combined they fall far short of compensating for the closure. Kuwait has essentially no bypass capacity, and Qatar, the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, ships virtually everything through the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar's entire national economy is built on LNG exports. The closure is not an inconvenience for Doha, it is an existential crisis happening in slow motion. But here's the development that should be dominating every front page and is not. This past weekend, an Iranian military commander announced that Iran's list of potential strike targets has been formally expanded, beyond military installations, to oil fields, to refineries. Across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. Read that again slowly. Iran is now saying, not only are we keeping the strait closed, but if the pressure on us intensifies, or if you attempt to move oil through alternative routes, we will strike the energy production infrastructure of every American allied nation in the region. The closure of the strait threatens roughly 20% of global oil supply. The strikes Iran is now describing could threaten 35 to 40%. There is no modern economic precedent for that scenario. There is a passage in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, that describes a coalition rising against Israel in the latter days. Among the nations named is Persia, the ancient name for modern Iran. The text describes a conflict centered in the Middle East, with Persia in a leading role, that threatens the economic stability of surrounding nations, and that ultimately draws the attention of the entire world. I am not standing here telling you the current conflict is the mechanical fulfillment of that prophecy. Biblical prophecy is rarely that straightforward, but the geographic alignment, the cast of nations, and the scale of potential consequences are more directly parallel to that ancient text than anything this region has produced in living memory. That is not sensationalism. That is pattern recognition at a level that deserves serious consideration. So what does a world look like where the Strait of Hormuz is permanently or semi-permanently restricted? It looks like the most expensive forced restructuring of global energy infrastructure in history. It looks like nations that currently import 80 or 90% of their energy from the Gulf, facing the kind of economic pressure that historically precedes political collapse. It looks like a new global energy map, where power shifts dramatically toward nations with domestic production. The United States, Russia, Canada, Brazil. It looks like energy security displacing every other consideration in national strategy permanently. And it looks like the foundational promise of the post-war international order that international waters are open and that American naval power guarantees that openness being tested and possibly broken in real time. Iran's strategy here is not military in the conventional sense. It is economic attrition. The calculation is this: the United States can project overwhelming force, but can it project overwhelming political will? Can an American administration sustain the economic and political pressure of this conflict long enough to break Iran's capacity to resist before Iran's closure of the strait breaks American political will? History offers cautionary examples on both sides. The American blockade of Cuba failed to break Castro. International pressure on South Africa contributed to the end of apartheid, though the timeline was long. The sanctions campaign against Iran's nuclear program eventually brought Tehran to the table in 2015, but not to its knees, and only after years of mounting costs. The key variable was always time. Who could sustain the pressure longer? Who flinched first? That clock is running right now. And when Iran declared this weekend that the strait will never return to its pre-war status, it was not a military communique, it was a psychological signal. It was Tehran telling Washington and telling the world, we are prepared to run out the clock. We will not blink first. Whether they can actually sustain that position, whether the economic siege on Iran's own population eventually fractures the regime's internal cohesion before the global economy fractures under the weight of the closure, that remains the open question at the center of the most consequential standoff of the 21st century. But the cost of finding out is not being paid by generals or by ministers. It is being paid by the 45 million people the World Food Program flagged as newly at risk, by factory workers in Germany and South Korea whose wages are being quietly eroded by energy costs they cannot name, by fishermen and sailors and traders whose entire livelihoods depend on the free passage of ships through 33 kilometers of blue water that a government they have never voted for has decided to weaponize. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed for the next 6 months or the next year, what happens to your country? Not in the abstract, to the prices you pay, to the stability of the government that governs you. And do you believe your leaders have given you an honest accounting of how prepared they actually are for that scenario? Write your answer in the comments. The people in this community are consistently among the most clear-eyed and serious thinkers engaging with these questions anywhere online. Your read on this matters, and I want to hear it. We cover developments like this every single day, not summaries, not takes, the actual mechanics of what is happening and why it matters to you. If that is what you are looking for, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you will not be the last to know when the next development breaks. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, shorter than most people's daily commute. And right now, it sits at the center of a confrontation that could redraw the global energy map, test the limits of American power, and determine the economic fate of billions of people who have never once looked at it on a map. Keep watching. Keep asking the questions those in power would prefer stayed unasked. And do not let anyone tell you this is just about oil.